Good morning. Welcome to part two of the Lifelong Learners of the Central Coast presentation on the California propositions. Good morning. My name is Ed Cabrera, and thank you for joining us for the last part of this two-part presentation. If you remember, in our first part, we discussed the background and history of the proposition movement in California, the mechanics, the process of the initiative process, also the controversy, the expense, and also the bond system in California. You also recall in our first presentation, we also managed to hit a few of the propositions before we wrapped it up. In part one of our presentation, we handled Proposition 15 on the assessment of commercial property, and 16, dealing with the question of affirmative action. 17, on the question of should parolees receive the right to vote. The 17-year-old voters' privilege to vote was discussed in Proposition 18, and we wrapped it up with Proposition 19, the transfer of tax base. You'll also recall that we handled propositions not in numerical order, but in themes. Today, we'll wrap it up with the last 7 amendments on the ballot. 14, stem cell research, the classification of offenders, rent control, gig economy, dialysis personnel, consumer privacy, and we'll wrap it up with the question of the replacement of bail. Those are the 7 propositions we will deal with today. And as I get back to the theme that we were finishing up in our first presentation was housing and Prop 13. The last proposition to fall under that heading is Proposition 21. Proposition 21 is going to be a law, statute, fancy word for a law, and it is sponsored primarily by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. All right, the history. There was a resounding defeat in 2018 on a rent control measure. The people spoke authoritatively. They liked the idea of rent control, but they didn't believe that the proposition was written specifically to their liking. One of the reasons that people voted it down was that only homes that are at least 15 years old were included, and it exempted single-family homes owned by landlords with no more than 2 properties. All right, just like last time, the main benefactor of this proposition is a gentleman by the name of Michael Weinstein, and he heads up the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Now, he was dealing with state lawmakers, and they were trying to reach a deal with Mr. Weinstein and the foundation. They said, let's put a cap of 7% ceiling that landlords can raise their rents every year. They were hoping that this would be the end of it, but it was not to the liking of Mr. Weinstein and the foundation. So we find ourselves dealing with the question one more time. Now, this would amend state law, and this would allow local governments to establish rent control. And once again, we're talking about residential properties over 15 years old. And it would be an incremental increase in rents that would be allowed, up to 15% over 3 years. But that's for new tenants, not old tenants, start of new tenants. So the proponents say there is room for landlords to make a profit. Now, this is not after the person who owns a couple of properties or less. They're not after the mom and pop landlord. They're after large landlords in this law. The people behind this, of course, are the foundation, but also a coalition of people, including Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party, the California Teachers Association, and the California Nurses Association amongst this coalition. Those people opposing them, also an interesting coalition. The NAACP, the AMVETS, the American Legion, the California Senior Advocates League, and another CTA, California Taxpayers Association. What's the cost? Well, the value of rental housing would decline because opponents say that landlords would leave the market because of the controls. And they would be doing this because they would expect less rental income. And opponents say this would actually work opposite of its intention in that the mobility of renters would not happen, therefore housing would not change hands. This law depends on individual local decisions as to whether they would adopt this rent control, and also how many properties are covered, and just how the formula is going to be deduced as to how rents are limited. Overall, revenues would be reduced long term because renters would be paying less rent. But on the other hand, perhaps it would be made up in the form of sales taxes because people would have more expendable income. The effect on state revenues is not clear. It depends on the movement in the market. $23 million have been spent by the foundation and their allies. On the other hand, real estate concerns, property owners, landlords have ponied up $50 million to fight this proposition. Let's look at some pros and cons. Pros: it does save money by preventing homelessness, say the proponents. It does provide stability in that people will stay in their homes. So not only stability to the common homeowner, but also more importantly to seniors and veterans. It doesn't really affect single family homeowners as far as rent is concerned. It does keep housings overall down, according to the proponents of the proposition. And still, landlords will be able to make a profit. It's supported by coalition, not just unions, but also civic organizations, justice groups, tenants unions, and legal aid organizations. On the other side, this is going to make the housing crisis worse, say the opponents. And what's going to happen is going to see a wholesale eviction of tenants in that perhaps landlords decide they're not going to rent anymore, and they might convert or sell for other purposes. The construction industry is going to be hurt because less landlords will be getting into the business, say opponents. Overall, they're saying that home values will come down. And it doesn't protect seniors, veterans, or the disabled, contrary to what the proponents say. And there really is not going to be any slowdown of the homeless situation. And moreover, there's going to be a bureaucracy of unelected officials who are going to be in charge of this program. And finally, state and local funds are going to be taken away to be given to schools and fire safety. So it's going to be moved from one pocket to the other. So let's get into a new theme, a new group of propositions. Crime. Crime is one of the largest issues in the state of California, and these propositions address that area. First of all, Proposition 20. It is an amendment, the amendment to the Constitution of California. And of course, when you're talking about an amendment, it required 900,000 signatures. Who's behind this? Law enforcement agencies. Now, we do know that in 2011, there was a landmark case in California, Brown versus Plata. It was concerning a system for incarceration, prisons in California, prisons designed to house 85,000 inmates. And at the time of the decision, it was almost twice that population in the prisons. So the Supreme Court found that California is violating the Eighth Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. And the Supreme Court was upholding a lower court's order to decrease the population. Not by the full amount, but by at least 46,000 inmates. Okay, there has been attempts to address this court order. There was AB 109 in 2011, Proposition 47 in 2014, and there was a Proposition 57 in the last presidential election. They are all meant to cut down on this population. How did they do that? Well, they moved some of the felons to state and local prisons. According to AB 109, and in 47, they reclassified felonies to misdemeanors to try and reduce the prison population. And they also addressed the question of parole, which ironically is up for discussion again this year in this election proposition. Now, it did bring down the population of prisoners, but not anywhere near where the courts have asked it to be. Hence, more action is needed in this area. So, what's it going to do? It's going to reduce the overall population by reclassification of nonviolent offenders who they've completed their time, and they're going to be released because standards and requirements are going to be lessened. So it's going to be a more liberal parole program. And here is the part that is very controversial to businesses such as grocery stores. In the past, if you stole something in the area of $250 or $300, it was considered a felony. It would move it up to $950. So a person complained the grocery stores knew that they were just going to get their hand slapped, and they were only going to be charged with a misdemeanor if they were shoplifting at their stores. So because of the more liberal 950 level, they saw more incidences of crime, and they would like to move it back down to the 250 level. Also, this proposition would require the DNA samples for misdemeanors, consequently building up the collection of record keeping for criminals in California. Who is backing this? Well, you see Democrats and Republicans, at least individuals, supporting this proposition. Name of note, Devin Nunes is a supporter of this proposition. The California Retailers Association, which is why down below I have in bold type Albertsons and Safeway, because I said the grocery stores are very much behind this proposition, as are the different police organizations you see at the bottom of the list. Who's against this? Well, institutionally, you see the governors, both present and past, and the Democratic Party who are against it, regardless of the individual in the Democratic Party who is for it. Teachers are against this. Probation officers are against this because they feel that it's too stringent. Here is that group that I mentioned last week. Priscilla Chan, Dr. Priscilla Chan, the wife of Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, and the mega union, SEIU, they're also behind the opposition to this proposition. What's it going to cost you? Well, it's going to cost tens of millions of dollars, because what's going to happen is, once again, the jail populations are going to increase because the law is more stringently being applied. And it's going to mean more in court-related costs. And it's also going to be costing more to collect these DNA samples. Where is the money coming from? Well, the police organizations are coming up with the lion's share of the money, over $3 million, whereas Zuckerberg and another benefactress, Patricia Quillen, is coming up with the giant share of their money, $5 million. Here are the pros. If you apply this proposition and it becomes law, it's not really affecting drug offenders, because there's a big opposition to people committing drug offenses being judged too harshly in our system. It does require the the poster children, the anti-poster children, the offenders and sexual predators, to complete their full sentences. More counseling is going to be offered as a result of this proposition, not less. And because even though unfairly, people say that people of color are being charged with crimes out of proportion to their percentage of the population, in this case, the propositions say those people are going to be protected against crime. Now, the opponents of this proposition said it's not really addressing the mental health question. In fact, it's doing the opposite. Mental health and rehabilitation programs will lose money. It's going to waste tens of millions of dollars on taxpayer monies. And by the way, if our prisons cannot accommodate these people, what will happen is there will be for-profit prisons that will be built in order to house these prisoners. And it would cut rehabilitation. That what would happen is that fewer people would re-enter society, and as a result, it would harm public safety in the long run. Proposition 25, also dealing with crime. This proposition is largely funded by the bail bond industry, and you're going to see quickly why. Here's another bill in 2018, proposition that was passed. And it was based on a bill, Senate Bill 10, that was ending cash bail. And what it was going to do is give more rights, give more leeway to judges to decide whether people should be released. Now, I'm probably in the same boat with you in that I'm a victim of watching too much crime shows on TV where the accused comes before the judge the day after they're charged and the question of bail comes up, at which point they qualify or don't qualify for bail and they're released. When in truth, I find that what happens is it may be days, weeks, sometimes even months, whether that actually occurs. And if people have money, there is a step prior to coming to court where someone can be released. Whereas if someone does not have money, they will spend that time in jail waiting for that first appearance in court. Now, when that bill was passed in 2018, if you studied it closely, it said even though it's passed in 2018, it cannot be implemented until after the 2020 election. So if you say, wait a minute, I didn't realize in the last 2 years we've done away with bail. We haven't. That change was called for by the voters to take place in 2018 to take place in 2020. So the bail bond industry has come forth strongly, and you're going to vote yes to keep that state law passed in 2018 or no to do away with that state law passed in 2018, and you're going to keep the bail system as it is. Okay, what would it do? Well, you're going to banish bail money. No more bail money. Consequently, no more bail bonds, no more bail bondsmen if this passes. The Democratic Party and its governor is strongly behind this. So is the union, the mega union, the SEIU, and the California Medical Association. Who's against this? Well, it comes as no surprise that the bail agents association is against it. Surprisingly, somebody might say, the NAACP is against this. And it's an interesting coupling with the California Peace Officers Association. They are against this. What's it going to cost? Well, it's going to cost more for the correctional system, because what's going to happen is you're going to see an increase in county jail populations and local supervision. You're going to have higher court-related costs as a result of this, because the courts are going to be making these decisions as opposed to the option of going with bail bondsmen. And of course, who's going to enforce the decisions of the court? Law enforcement. So they're all going to see increased costs if this passes. $8 million have been put forth by benefactors, primarily Ballmer affiliates, as I told you in our last meeting. Steve Ballmer, is the owner of the NBA basketball team, the Los Angeles Clippers. And he is joined by another benefactor, John Arnold. And the bail bond companies and insurance companies are putting forth monies against this proposition. Pros. Well, as I explained before, if you have money, if you're rich, you don't spend the night in jail. You are quickly, unless of course it's a very serious crime, you don't spend the night in jail, whereas poor defendants do. And if you're found not guilty or the charges are dropped, well, you still spent that time in jail and you still owe that fee to the bail bondsman, which is 10%. So if it's a $20,000 bail, you are out of $2,000. For a middle class person, doable. For a lower class person, quite onerous. Now, the opponent said, okay, the intentions are good, but what you're going to see is you're going to actually see more people jailed than under the current situation if judges decide to be more conservative. And it's going to be a lot of money spent by taxpayers because courts will be overburdened with having to make this decision as opposed to utilizing the less complicated bail system. Whole new bureaucracy is going to be created, which is where a lot of this money is going to go. Let's go to another group, another theme, the theme of labor versus management. Proposition 22. It is a statute. And as we identified last week, this is the most expensive proposition in the country. Easily in California, but in the country, number one. And maybe it went by too fast. Here, it is largely funded by 3 high-tech companies that head this new, what is referred to as the gig economy. Now, here's the history. A law was passed last year, Assembly Bill 5. And what it did is it fell in line with a court ruling that made it harder for companies, for people to treat their employees as contractors, as opposed to full-fledged employees. And it's just exactly what it sounds like. If you are redoing your kitchen, you don't have an employee to your family do the work. You employ a contractor who has their own system for paying their employees, insurance, benefits, etc. Contractors. Now, what it did is it ruined the business model of companies like Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, Instacart, and there are others, but they are the largest companies who are fighting this proposition. So, what has happened to Assembly Bill 5? Well, those companies that I identified have been fighting it all along, and they have been violating Assembly Bill 5. They have been sued by the state. I should say allegedly violating. They haven't been found guilty. And what has happened is that they are fighting back with this proposition. So it all comes back to a decision in the court, as I mentioned before. It was Dynamex versus Superior Court of Los Angeles. And the decision came up with a 3-factor test. If a company wants to prove that an employee is not an employee, then they have to prove that the person is free from control. So let's use Uber as an example. If you are driving for Uber, Uber has to prove that you're free from control. And we don't have any connection with your performance of work. Also, we have to prove, if we want to say you're a contractor and not an employee, that you perform work outside the usual course of my company, so that you might drive for somebody else, or you're a taxi driver, or something that has to be something aligned to what my company's primary business is. And that you work independently, and of something of the same nature that's involved in the work performed, so that you also drive for somebody else, or you have your own business, that you're actually a professional driver, and Uber just happens to be one of the companies that you drive for. So that's a three-factor test. If you can prove that, then you can say that you are a contractor and you're an employee. Now, this app-based economy, another word for the gig economy, would turn these drivers into independent contractors. Consequently, Lyft and Uber wouldn't have to provide the benefits that other employers provide, such as standard wage and hour restrictions. It would also guarantee that the drivers would earn an earnings floor. In other words, we are going to guarantee you X amount of hours, and we're going to give you a stipend, by the way, so that you can purchase your own health insurance and you could provide other minimum benefits for yourself. But remember, you are an independent contractor if this proposition passes, not an employee of these companies. Here are the supporters. The left side does not surprise you. The right side is an education, because it does cover the gamut of the traditional minorities. The NAACP, the Asian American Association, and the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Who is against this proposition? Unions. Unions. What's it going to cost? Well, the companies are not going to be on the dime for people's benefits. And if you're looking for a ride, it's going to drop your fares and fees. Now, interestingly enough, drivers supposedly would earn more income. And if they earn more income, they pay more taxes. And if you own stock in these companies, you earn a higher income. You pay more income taxes. Now, we don't know exactly what these numbers are going to be. Obviously, it depends on how many rides you call for. Here's the money being thrown around. This is why this is the most expensive proposition in the United States. $184 million paid by the tech companies. And it's not too shabby on the part of the unions. They're spending $10 million on their own, but far outspent by the proponents. Here are the pros. It supports the independence of these people. And I have talked to individuals who drive, and they say that a lot of them say that it's going to increase their flexibility. And it is going to provide benefits to these drivers. Guarantees of $20 an hour. Healthcare, if you work 15 hours a week, and insurance. And it is going to be better for public safety because of the insurance coverage and because these people will be better provided for. Now, the opponents say, wait a minute, did you look at the list of proponents? It's those companies that are going to profit, not the larger number of other companies that would also like to get in on this deal. Drivers already drive more than 30 hours. So it's not something new. You would legally deny paid sick leave, workers' comp, and unemployment benefits because these people are contractors, individual contractors, not employees. And this is old news. These companies, according to the opponents of this proposition, are only doing this because they've been sued for breaking the present law. And they're only going to be giving their their contractors, almost said employees, that which you're supposed to get anyway. So you should not be congratulated for providing what should be provided. Prop 23. It's a statute, which is a law. And here again, the giant union, the SEIU, is pushing this proposition. There are two major providers in the state of California for dialysis clinics, DaVita Kidney Care and Fresenius Medical Care. And for years, they've been locked in a death struggle with the SEIU. SEIU wants to unionize their employees. Now, what they've done in the past is they tried to cap reimbursement rates to clinics. And there's a whole number of possible ballot measures so that they would boost their staff spending. And in the most recent election, 2018, there was Prop 8 to deal with this question. And the proposition was soundly defeated. The dialysis firms spent over $100 million, which up to that point, until the last proposition came about, it was the most expensive ballot campaign ever. This one, interestingly enough, at this point is not going to be as expensive, but pretty darn close. This came as a surprise to me. 80,000 Californians receive dialysis care every year, and we have almost 600 clinics. And as I told you before, these two giant companies control 72% of the business in the state. It's a $3 billion business. Now, presently, there is a doctor who will see a patient, but only by law is required to see them once a month. Now, there is also a federal law that requires that a physician be at each clinic for 1/4 of their time. So one physician per 4 clinics. And what they do is they rotate from clinic to clinic. What would this proposition do? It's going to require a licensed physician during the treatment of outpatient kidney dialysis clinics. Now, neither side debates the number that we're talking about where things go bad quickly. It's really low, right around 3% where there is a physician's skill needed to take care of the challenge. Now, what this would do is that if you have a rural clinic where there's a shortage of physicians in the area, they would allow the clinic to substitute a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant to serve in lieu of the physician. And they would also want a dual reporting of infection data to the state. And you cannot close a clinic if this proposition is passed without the approval of the state. And you cannot refuse services to a patient because of insufficient funds. Who's behind this? There they are again, the SEIU and other health care unions and the California Democratic Party. The dialysis clinics are against this. So is the California Medical Association, American Legion, and the California AACP. What's it going to cost you? Well, it's going to cost the clinics quite a bit more because they're going to have to hire a licensed physician. This is going to cost about a few $100,000 a year per clinic. And so people could foresee that some of these costs are going to be passed on to either the individual or your insurance company. The total estimate in the low tens of millions of dollars annually. The clinics have put up 93% $3 million. Remember 2018, the total bill was 111 million. So we're reaching that. Now, this, of course, were numbers that I collected last week. So we could be approaching that $111 million point very soon in the future. Pros. If things go bad, even though we're talking about 3%, what if it's your loved one in that 3%? We should have a patient, have the availability to a doctor. We need to have more reporting and transparency. What is going on in those clinics? The state should be informed about what's going on. So we need more protection. Now, the dialysis firms say, there's no way of cutting it. Eventually, we're going to have to reduce the number of services. We're going to have to close clinics, which is going to put more people in jeopardy. If we had a shortage of physicians, we're going to have an even greater ones. And they're going to go to the urban areas as opposed to the rural areas. They're already regulated, the clinics, according to the firms. And people already get a high quality care. So we have two more propositions to cover, and they are kind of deja vu. Other questions that have been dealt with by California voters, and we're going to see them repackaging of them for the 2020 ballot. First of all, 14. It is a bond. It is going to cost the state of California millions. In fact, in this case, $3 billion is what it cost in 2004 for Proposition 71, which is essentially what we're talking about today. It is the same proposition. We are just renewing it because back in 2004, the purpose of the bond was to fund stem cell research. So that $3 billion, which was given to the firm, California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, is gone. Well, almost. It is run by a gentleman, a real estate developer, a gentleman by the name of Robert Klein. He was the first board director, and he is the force behind California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. We know that stem cells, they exist within human beings. Now, there's a potential for the regeneration of cells. And the hope is that they would be used to treat diseases. And there has been some success in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, HIV/AIDS, stroke, diabetes, and cancer. What would it do? Well, it was $3 billion last time. Now we're talking about a package of $5.5 billion. They're obligation bonds, which means the state would have to pay them back. And it would be used for research, development, and also delivery of any vaccines and or fines, research fines, and also a bill for additional facilities construction. A galaxy of organizations which are fighting diseases. Interestingly enough, there are a couple of doctors who you will find have signed the con statement to the proposition, and two papers, prominent papers, have come out against this proposition. Now, it's going to cost $7.8 billion over a 30-year period, because you're talking about not only the principal of 5.5, but interest. This is going to take $260 million every year for the next 30 years out of the general fund. The general fund, remember, is used to pay for other costs as well, like healthcare and education. Now, A positive is that if there's any invention that come out of this research, the state is first in line to gain revenue. Now, the fiscal effect is uncertain, and that's because of different reactions from healthcare programs such as Medicare, Medi-Cal, and the net fiscal impact is unknown. Now, organizations have been organized to fund the proposition efforts. Case in point, 5 out of the 9 million comes from Klein Financial Corporation. Remember that Mr. Klein is on the board. And there is no real opposition, as far as money is concerned, to this proposition. Now, the people say, we got trials that are approved by the FDA, not easy to get. Over almost 3,000 medical discoveries because of the money that Californians raised for the last venture. And that group that I gave you, the proponents, is just a partial group. There are 70 different patient groups that are advocating passage of this proposition. And it will, in the long run, improve the access to these new finds and affordability. And we are increasing jobs. Much of the money will be spent on labor costs. And we are going to report not only our research, but our findings as well. Obviously, we're talking about big money, the opponents say. We're talking about higher taxes. Californians are going to have to pay this money back. Now, it really hasn't paid back the way it was supposed to pay back. Many people call it a disappointment, regardless of the numbers on the left column. Bad timing. Are you really asking Californians to pony up that kind of money in the time of COVID and recession? Perhaps the intentions are good, but not now. It is not the answer. And the reason that it's not the answer is 2 reasons. First of all, the board is private and they do not report to the state. And the bureaucracy has challenges. But probably the major reason why people are opposing this proposition is because at the beginning, California was the leader in the nation. They were the first to mount a wholesale effort in stem cell research. Since then, the National Institute of Health also has a major effort. So people are saying, this is redundant. California led the way, now let the federal government take over. Why should California foot the bill? The final proposition, Proposition 24. It is also a statute, a law, largely championed by an individual and his wife, Alastair and Celine McTaggart. It is about privacy. In 2018, 2 years ago, California did pass a Consumer Privacy Act. And it was to find out just exactly what is that data that's being collected about us. And let's see if we can get rid of it. Now, ever since then, 2018, you would have thought that Mr. McTaggart would have been satisfied, would have been happy, but no. He wants to solidify it. He wants to strengthen it. So this is why we're having a redo. Now, not only is he doesn't want to share it, he says it shouldn't be sold at all. And he wants this as passed as an initiative versus legislation from Sacramento, because then it would be harder to weaken in the future. We already have the strongest in the nation consumer privacy law. And now we want it stronger yet, say the proponents. These are the people who are pushing for the proposition. Common sense, firefighters, Consumer Watchdog, comment AFSCME, California. Interestingly enough, the California Nurses Association is fighting this proposition. Their allies are League of Women Voters of California, Media Alliance, and the Consumer Federation of California. And I'll tell you why in a minute. What will be the cost? Well, there is going to be more bureaucracy, and it's going to take $10 million to fund them. And we are talking about money to increase court costs and enforcement costs. The proponent said, this money is not going to come from the taxpayer, it's going to come from penalties from those people violating these laws. Mr. McTaggart has paid the entire bill to pass this Proposition 24. His monies beggar those monies that are being raised to fight this proposition. Now he's talking about protecting sensitive data. And he's saying, yes, there were protections of our data, but now we're going to have even more stringent protections. And the reason we're doing the initiative route is because in the future, it'll be harder to weaken it. And we don't care for the way that these large tech companies are doing business. We don't trust them with our data. And it is going to be even stronger in the area of minors to protect those people under the age of 16. Now, the opponents say, wait a minute, you passed the law 2 years ago. We really don't know whether it's been effective. And we say that half the privacy experts really don't know if it's been effective or this new proposition is needed. And when you go out to spank people, the large tech companies are hardly going to be hurt by this proposition. And it's the opposite. It's the new companies that are just starting out which will be hurt by this proposition. This is a list of the resources that are available that you can take your time and look at if you see this in a recording. So that is a rundown on the propositions. This recording will be available on YouTube, so that you can see it at a much slower and palatable speed. I want to thank you for your patience and your attention. It is a daunting election year, and hopefully I've been of some service to you. Thank you for your attention, and vote.